this interdepartmental committee. This was very interesting for me because South Africa was a bit of an anomaly in a lot of ways, where you had social Darwinism being thoroughly discredited by the 1940s, largely because of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and people could see the end result of social Darwinism and eugenics. It fell out of favor very rapidly after that, but it was 3 years after the Second World War that South Africa began implementing apartheid. The apartheid government was elected. So while the way of speaking about social Darwinism was disappearing in the academy, the South African state was actually becoming more and more founded on it. So when you look at the Interdepartmental Committee on the Abuse of Dagga, which I'll just refer to as RICAD from here on, you find this interesting way that the culture of a society will tend to replicate itself, but also change at the same time. Like I mentioned before, history is about continuity and change. And the language changed. But if you look at the report, you'll see that the ideas behind it stayed the same. So if you look at page 912, there's an they speak about moral degeneration. And they open by saying Dagga is apparently the least dangerous of habit-forming drugs. And then, when used in moderation, as it is apparently used by large numbers of the natives, and when smoked in the traditional manner through water, its effects are not serious. In fact, probably no more deleterious than smoking tobacco. But immediately, it goes back to its former arguments. That overindulgence, however, leads to physical, mental, and moral deterioration. And that my focus there is moral deterioration. It's a moral issue. Physically, the inveterate Dagga addict is emaciated and constitutionally weak and incapable of sustained work. He inevitably degenerates morally too. And then again, saying it does not produce any permanent psychotic condition. It does produce very definite moral degeneration. So they refer to Dagga as the evil in this report, and showed a tacit acceptance of that racial hierarchy by bringing in ideas of moral deterioration and by separating the report into the different racial groups, which would be expected from the apartheid state. If you look under the section in that report entitled Present Non-European Attitudes Towards Dagga Smoking, you'll see that they say the native view is that there is nothing reprehensible about Dagga smoking in itself. And this is not changed by the fact that the law of the white man now forbids the practice. In the paragraph that follows, they address the colored community. And they made their view known, as I've written here, by saying that they recognize the habit as a concomitant of poverty, backwardness, dirtiness, crime, unemployment, and a general lack of respectability. They're speaking about the colored view of cannabis. This immediately shows, through the use of the term recognize, that the authors retained the idea of the natives' backwardness, and that the so-called colored community was somehow less backward by recognizing this fact. They spoke about Asiatics after that, as they classified them, and said that only the poor classes would take to Dagga smoking, and they're consequently looked down on by the others. Of Europeans, it said, it is hardly ever practiced by persons who are or wish to be thought respectable. So what they do here is they establish a link between respectability and cannabis use and different racial groups. So the Commission portrays the natives as unapologetic cannabis users, less than respectable, and the colored community retain a degree of respectability. And the European, who hardly ever uses cannabis, gets the highest point of respectability. So you'll see that while the language has changed, you can see the threads of that same old way of thinking which had now been discredited coming through in the early apartheid state. I'm sorry, there's something that's just come into my mind about what I was saying earlier. I'd like to get back to it before I forget it. Because I haven't spoken about the 1922 Act. South Africa actually prohibited cannabis, or allowed for the prohibition. It was in the Customs and Excise Amendment Bill. But what was interesting about that time was they said to the people who were largely against cannabis prohibition, they said that it wouldn't be enforced, that there was no need to concern about amongst the native commissioners and the like. There was no need for them to be concerned about this law being passed because it wouldn't be enforced in the rural areas. I believe the phrase was of little importance to law and order. I just wanted to fill you in there. We was talking again about the international prohibition, but the local prohibition, when it was enforced, it was openly said that it would not be enforced in the rural areas and it would only be enforced in the urban centres. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Can you tell us about the Department of Social Welfare and Pension? Drawing your attention back to page 845 and the quote.
Yes, I see that there's another error here in 1.16. It says RICAD. That is not RICAD. That is drug abuse and some of its concomitant aspects in the Republic of South Africa, which was a publication by the Department of Social Welfare and Pensions.
So the Department of Social Welfare and Pensions, through this report, you say in 2.1.16, in an attempt to account for the use of cannabis by whites from good homes.
Yes,
that's in
yes.
Quotes, attempted to frame the hippie phenomenon as a cult,
yes,
and went on to purport
yes,
a link to the danger suffered by hippies by their cannabis use. Tell us about that.
Well, it's quite interesting. From everything I've described to you, you'll see it didn't make sense that civilized people from good homes, in other words, middle class, white population, would use cannabis. And when it got to the 1970s, they had the hippie phenomenon was emerging around the world. Cannabis use was spreading amongst the white middle classes globally. And it came to the attention of the South African government that there were whites from good homes smoking cannabis in South Africa. But because it didn't really fit into their framework, they had to find another way of understanding the use of cannabis by this demographic. And they decided to do it by classifying it as a cult.
Sorry, you said by classifying it
as a cult. If I could just find the section that quotes some of this. Here we go, 916. So I say here, it wasn't until 1970 this is, that the government approached the topic again. So I was speaking about the report of the Interdepartmental Committee. In 1970, they said the illicit traffic in Dagga seemed to be increasing tremendously. And they published a work, the Department of Social Welfare and Pensions published this drug dependence, I refer to it as drug abuse, drug dependence and some of its concomitant aspects in the Republic of South Africa. Now, if you look at that report, the first section of the report is entitled The Dagga Problem. It's almost exactly the same information as you found in the 1952 report. Updated statistics and things like that, but the information is largely the same. The second half of the report, forgive me, Milo.
Yes.
I also just want to mention, with regard to the Rickard report, the Borhill's thesis that spoke of before, at the beginning of my chapter 2. I mentioned when I spoke about that it wasn't very influential at the time of publication, and that it became influential later.
Yes.
It became influential in 1952 when it was reprinted specifically for the use of the... I mention that because it does show how when the language changes, it doesn't mean that the beliefs underneath basing a lot of their work on an incredibly racist document. So I felt that was worth mentioning. So as I said, they had a lot of overlap in the 1970 report and the 1952 report. Presented the formulation of these ideas with the new language, these social Darwinist ideas in a new language, saying criminal and sexual tendencies are normally controlled and repressed. They may find expression under the influence of Dagga. This seems acceptable since it has been proved that all inhibitions are dispelled during Dagga smoking and that the true personality emerges. We've got a sort of ethno-psychiatric view coming through there as well. Therefore, a person with tendencies towards murder, theft, and other criminal offences would be capable of committing such crimes under the influence of the drug. And they say it's a susceptibility to suggestion. They say this may account for the massacres of the Voortrekkers and the Mau Mau acts of violence. Again, speaking about black violence and black criminality. They also mention the use of cannabis by the Mongol and Chinese hordes at one stage. Now, the interesting part of this 1970 report is definitely section 2 that discusses the hippie cult. Most obviously, it refers to it as a cult and describes how youths from good homes are drawn into these antisocial systems. In reference to Johannesburg, it said there are about 300 to 500 persons who answer to the general description of hippie. Then there are a large number of young people who may be said to be on the fringe of the hippie way of life, perhaps several thousand of them, according to observations, and they are in constant danger of being drawn in. The definitions that they use for hippies are very telling. Say individuals or groups of individuals who have no regular or honest means of livelihood, live in small groups in unsavory living conditions in disorganized areas of the city, are untidy and peculiar in appearance, are in revolt of the established modes and behavior and value systems, and make use of drugs. So again, we've got that link between respectability and cannabis use. It's not that this report is very interesting in that if you look at the way that a hippie is defined, they discuss it as if it's a drug report. But in this section on the hippie cult, they actually deal very little with drugs. They mention it almost as a side thing. It's almost a political definition that they deal with. When they're talking about the list of characteristics, which I think are, yes, here on page 918, where's the detail here? 2 of the characteristics contained any mention of drugs. This is out of the 10 points that they considered characteristics of being in this cult. One said that there is considerable trafficking in cannabis, LSD, and other drugs, and they are used freely. Often the hippies are under the influence of these drugs. And employment. But if you look at the other characteristics that they mention there, they discuss rebellion. Their contention is that adults use double standards and they want to be free to do as they please. Another one, they have gatherings in parks or other public places, for example, where inflammatory speeches are made. Present are exhorted to take part in demonstrations and confront the police with passive resistance. Another, the better organized communities distribute their own newspapers or pamphlets, which often contain overt or veiled advertisements on such subjects as homosexuality. So this hippie cult drew the idea of respectability and drug use and framed white middle-class drug use in a way that they would understand. But at the same time, it's clear that their concern wasn't actually the drug use. Their concern was the breakdown in social authority, the authority of the state and the way that it was confronted, and the moral order. But it's very interesting that they couldn't accommodate white middle-class use of cannabis into the schema that they had created and had to frame. I think that's what I've got to say on that.
Well, that would take us to a new theme in the experts' evidence. So I see it is 6 minutes to. Perhaps we could take the adjournment earlier and perhaps start 5 minutes earlier, if that suits you, Lordship.
Take the adjournment.